All right, Ron, can you see if you have if you're able to?
Oh yeah, there it is.
All
Awesome.
right, cool. Tim is not going to be able to make it, he says.
All right.
We'll give it I guess we'll give it a couple more minutes and we'll get started.
Yeah, another few minutes.
Oh, yeah. Kira, can you working okay over there? I've had to admit you several times. Nope, he's gone again.
I am going to.
Hi, Jill.
Ah, yes. Hi, Jill. Glad you could make it.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
All right. Somebody joining by phone. I don't know. That's new.
Yeah, this is Kieran. I was having a problem with my Zoom.
Kira, I figured that was you.
my Zoom was dropping me off, so I just dialed in.
So, Dan, do you think I should try maybe sending the email one more time to see if we get?
You can, yeah, but I think we should get started.
All right. Let me just. Yeah, I guess we should just get started now. You're right. So, yeah, it's just a little strange because this is so much less. The meeting is so much smaller than it typically is. Welcome everyone to the July 2020 general meeting of Our Revolution Arlington. Everyone here, I see we don't have any first timers here. This is all, yeah.
We know
This is,
everyone here.
yeah, we know everyone here. I don't feel like I have to go into, I don't feel like I have to go into a whole big spiel about who we are and what we do or any of that. We'll just jump right into tonight's presentation. And tonight we have Ron Hayduk. He's am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes.
Yes, he's a professor of political science at San Francisco State University, here to talk to us about extending the right to vote to non-citizen residents, which is something that I have been wanting us to have a presentation on for well over a year now, which came from when we were doing, I mentioned this briefly a few minutes ago, that it came about, my thoughts on this came about as a result of all the work we tried to do to stop Amazon HQ2 from coming here and to stop the county from giving $23 million in subsidies. At the public hearing for that meeting, the room was packed, and it was 50-50 the people who supported the incentives package for Amazon, and about half of the room was people who were against it. And the people who were for it were who you would expect: the business owners, the real estate developers, real estate agents, things like that. And the people who were against it were union leaders, activist groups, and a lot of immigrant rights groups. And despite that, the county board, despite that 50-50 split, the county board voted 5-0 in favor of the subsidies. And it got me into this kind of depressive funk for about a week, where I was like, why does any of this matter? It's all just going to be ignored. We're never going to be able to achieve the things we want. And even if we do, it'll just get undone. And it occurred to me that a big part of the reason for that is because a huge chunk of the population isn't able to vote. They don't have any say over the policies that affect them directly. Millions of people have no say over the conditions they live in this country. And that impacts how politicians are going to write laws, what laws they're going to pass, how they campaign, all sorts of different things. And so I've been searching for someone to speak on this for over a year now, and luckily, unfortunately, COVID caused this, but luckily, I finally found someone who's written extensively on this. So, really quick before we start, we're recording this, right, Dan?
I'm recording it.
Fantastic. So, yeah, with that in mind, all that being said, I will yield the floor to you, Ron.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a real privilege and pleasure and honor to be with you all. And I hope my comments are helpful to advance your work, right? So that's really why I was so excited to hear from you, Dan, because I've talked to a bunch of folks from lots of different states and cities around the country for the last 20 years, a little bit even more than that. And so I'm hopeful that I can serve you all the way I've been able to do that for some other folks. It's a real privilege to, talk to different community groups, immigrant rights groups, faith-based groups, union folks, and some relatively progressive elected officials who champion different strategies to advance inclusion, equality, and justice. And this is one of those tools, or one of these strategies that people have picked up to try to further those goals. So, well, let me just show you a picture and tell you a little bit about what I'm going to try to talk about. So I came to this work, as I shared with you, Dan, through my work as an activist in New York City and a graduate student. And then I got a job working for New York City government as the coordinator to a small city agency, an election agency mandated to facilitate voter participation of underrepresented groups. It was a reform advanced by voting rights advocates. And one of the things New York City had at the time, this quirky thing that I didn't even really know about until I got the job, was that immigrants could vote in school board elections. And my job was to go find immigrant rights organizations and parent groups and get them registered to vote and have them vote in the school board elections that happened in May This is back in 1993, so I'm an old person. And this is when Rudolph Giuliani was facing off against David Dinkins, the first African-American mayor in New York City, relatively progressive. At least he opened the door to a lot of community groups to come in. Anyway, so like immigrants participated, and then like in the November election, you know, those same hundreds of thousands of immigrants that voted in the May elections couldn't vote in the general election. And Giuliani beat Dinkins by 50,000 votes out of 2 million votes cast, like 2%. And if they could have voted, guess what? We wouldn't have had the scourge of Rudolph Giuliani, not just in New York City, but we've seen him nationally. So it kind of like also, as it sounds like it did to you, Dan, kind of opened my eyes like, wow, you know, that's an interesting thing to think about. Like, because there were voting rights folks who were trying to advance this to general elections. And in Tacoma Park, Maryland, made national news right around that time when they enfranchised immigrants in local elections, and other places like DC and places in Massachusetts launched campaigns. And so, you know, it seemed like, oh, there's a possibility. And that's sort of one of the things that I want to talk about is like, why do people, this is sort of a little outline of my presentation, sort of want to answer in make 3 points, right? One is, I guess, you know, that it's legal, that there's this long, extensive history of immigrants voting, and immigrants actually vote today, unbeknownst to a lot of folks. And, you know, obviously it's sort of the right thing to do, and that it's feasible. And there's lots of information I hope I can share with you about, you know, that may be useful in if you wanted to all try to advance this, or immigrant rights folks there in the area want to advance it. Maybe some of this might be useful to you. So first, a little bit about the history. You know, it's a bit of a fraught history, as most of American history is. And I guess just to sort of say, what is immigrant voting? Well, you know, it's basically voting rights for people that are not US citizens. It's called non-citizen voting, immigrant voting, or historically it was called alien suffrage. But what a lot of folks are sort of surprised to learn is that, you know, the practice was quite extensive. We're talking about 40 states, right, allowed immigrants to vote at some point in time in their state history, from, you know, the founding of the American Republic to 1926. So that's like the majority of the country's history in most of the country. And it flowed from, on the positive side, you know, some of the sort of the democratic thrust of the American Revolution, right? Like, as reflected in these lovely democratic slogans and principles, like no taxation without representation, and that government should rest on the consent of the governed. And, you know, early states like Virginia and other places that became states, Congress allowed immigrants to vote once they had 2 years of residency as an incentive to sort of settle the West. And that sort of points to the sort of seamy side. But I like to say, you know, immigrant voting is as American as apple pie and as older than our national pastime, baseball. You know, immigrants, you know, kind of help determine the winners and losers. And that, you know, this point that immigrant voting or voting is not tied to citizenship. Doesn't need to be. It's not intrinsically tied, and it wasn't historically and legally tied. You know, that's something that immigrants today grab onto, or voting rights advocates, as a means to, you know, adjust our current practices to make them more democratic. But like everything else, you know, it's fraud. I mean, this whole business of, you know, voting had more to do with if you were like race, right? It was like white male property holders could vote, right? So it was racist, sexist, and classist. And it really supported and buttressed the power of white male Christian property holders, and had this sort of settler colonial, dimension, right? This incentive to have people settle the West really fostered the dispossession of native peoples from their lands. And it was also used as a wedge between immigrants and women and the abolitionists that sought the vote, right? Like, we're going to give immigrants the right to vote, but we're going to not give women the right to vote. And there was a Supreme Court decision that actually explicitly made that that connection. But again, on the positive side of the ledger, it really did help elevate immigrant voices and advance immigrant issues, aiding, the Germans, the Irish, the Italians, the Jews, and others to have their issues and interests taken up and represented, which is partly why, why it was rolled back, because at some points the immigrant vote became sizable and significant and posed a threat. And in some places it was really interesting because it facilitated sort of like multiracial working class alliances. So like in Florida, in Key West, there's a scholar named Paul Ortiz wrote this wonderful book about sort of Black and Latinx history of the United States. And he talks about how Key West, Florida, Cuban refugees and African Americans and the Knights of Labor formed an alliance and essentially came to power and produced this really sort of progressive place that he says was the freest town in the South. Anyway, the point of the takeaway, right, is that voting is not necessarily, intrinsically, inevitably, nor need it be about citizenship. And it's really always about, who has a say, who's included, who is excluded. And, that's sort of why immigrant rights folks pick it up today and say, yeah, just like other excluded groups, we want in, we want to have our say. Okay, well, if it was so extensive, what the hell happened? Why was it eliminated? I alluded to how, I guess it's nothing surprising, the sort of nativistic fear and loathing that we see on display today, right? That as larger numbers of immigrants, especially Southern and Eastern Europeans, and the sort of rapid economic change that happened associated with industrialization and urbanization and conflict between contending social and political groups, but also sort of wars. I'm pointing to the earlier period of the War of 1812, because that's when and why Virginia rolled it back in 1818, right? Like, they sacked and burned the White House, right? Fear of foreign enemies, right? Or the Civil War, where the Southern states, the first plank in the Confederate Constitution required that people were born in the United States in order to have voting rights. And, the Irish were largely for immigrant voting and not for slavery, and other immigrant groups. And so, so there was different periods of time, but it was this real sort of, large influx of immigrants and, folks who spoke different languages, were not seen as white in the taxonomy of the day. There are population projections that the United States would become non-white. These are seen as not real Americans, held politically suspect views. Sound familiar? So that sort of elite reaction was tied to also the rise of mass social movements, the labor movements, socialist movement, third parties, the populist movement, the Populist Party, and elites moved to restrict voting and eliminate immigrant voting, but they also imposed, this is the time that poll taxes, literacy tests, restricted registration and voter registration, residency laws were enacted, a host of measures that really disenfranchised literally millions of people. Voter participation dropped from like 70 to 80% on average from like 1840 to 1900 in national and even some state and local elections, down to 49% in 1924. So these measures were quite effective. I mean, there was other changes to the party system, but you know, this really did do the trick. It was designed to limit the threat of the use of the vote by factions within parties as well as third parties that were a threat to the elites within both parties. And, you know, immigrant voting was sort of a casualty of these conflicts. But it really did limit progressive possibilities in the US for decades. And it was, you know, the New Deal that really sort of helped begin to open that up. But I'm going to sort of fast forward to the civil rights movement, which really, you know, swept away many of these barriers to voting and helped to really open the doors to immigrants. I always like to remind people that immigrants really owe a great debt to African Americans. I mean, we all do, for the liberation movements that have been waged. But in the 60s, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, came just before the act that opened the doors to immigrants from non-European countries that have created the hyperdiversity that we see in the world in our country today. You know, places, continents where people were excluded, right, from Latin America, South America, Asia, Caribbean, Africa, other places. So anyway, today immigrants are sort of reclaiming this history, right? And they seek to restore immigrant voting as a way to sort of write themselves into this history and claim rights and their legitimate place in local polities or the polity more broadly. This tool of immigrant voting is sort of alongside of other tools that immigrant advocates have advanced, right? Sanctuary policies, driver's licenses, in-state tuition, and so forth, legal services. But, you know, this is another tool in the toolbox for equity, right? Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about a lot of people, as Dan alluded to, right? 1 in 10 people in the United States is foreign born. In some places, that percentage is quite high. In California, it's 20% of the population. In some jurisdictions, it can be quite high. It can be like 1/3 to 1/4 of the population in some districts. I don't know what it is in Arlington, but my hunch is it's probably sizable. You know, what does that really mean for democratic principles of one person, one vote, or, you know, sort of rivals the exclusion of other previously excluded groups that we say, you know, was wrong. So this is, again, why immigrants say, hey, you know, the same is true about what are the consequences. Not a random portion of the population that's excluded, and that has consequences. Immigrants score low on every measure of well-being, from wages to housing to education and health. And, you know, 1 in 4 immigrant children are food insecure and go hungry. And the discriminatory policy and practices in employment and housing and education and criminal justice, not to mention the xenophobic hate crimes and arbitrary detention deportation policies, you know, in part flow from their being politically excluded. Because as Dan said, you know, policymakers can ignore them. Why should they pay attention if they don't really have to really pay attention to their complaints, even when they show up to meetings, right? Because they can't vote. They can't vote against them. They can't vote for them. They're excluded. So, you know, okay, maybe we have some good elected officials, but, you know, the whole point of it is luck should not play a role in our political system. And the vote's a mechanism that can be used to keep people accountable. So here are the places where immigrant voting has or is practiced in the United States today, or there's campaigns that have been launched in the recent past. So New York City, as I mentioned, was one of the first places to allow immigrant voting. And there's currently a campaign to restore immigrant voting in local elections, which probably is gonna be relaunched again next year, after this year's election. Chicago's a place where immigrants vote in school board elections. They've been doing that for 25 years, 30 years almost. Maryland is the place where it's most extensively practiced. It's actually 10 towns that have been doing immigrant voting for a while. San Francisco passed it this past 2016 and had an election in 2018. It's going to have another election this year, school board elections. Massachusetts has passed legislation in 4 municipalities, but they can't implement those laws without state enabling legislation, unlike Maryland, where municipalities can enact it on their own without the state saying yes or no. And that's one of those questions, right? Because there's other places like Texas, Connecticut, Minnesota, DC, Maine, and Vermont that have tried to pass it, but they need state enabling legislation to move forward.
Virginia is actually one of those states as well. We're a Dillon rule state.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's unfortunately one of the barriers for many people. But there's some creative strategies that really lovely lawyers have helped people figure out. Like in California, it says in the state constitution, only citizens can vote, but it also says that charter cities have powers to go sort of beyond the floor. So think of that as the floor, but not the ceiling. You could go higher than the floor, that citizens have to be able to vote, but it doesn't say that non-citizens can't vote, right? So they've crafted, lawyers have helped craft measures that could be tested in the courts, but have been the basis by which people have been able to make the case that the city of San Francisco and other charter cities in California could enact immigrant voting on their own. I'm not sure if that's applicable to Arlington in Virginia, but that's something that some attorneys might be able to help think that through. Anyway, let me just conclude by sharing a quote from Jamie Raskin, who was one of the people that helped win immigrant voting in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and kind of put this on the political map for people, and wrote a seminal legal brief, a legal law review journal article about immigrant voting that's been a great teacher for me. And he's still someone who advocates for this and is now a congressperson from Maryland, as well as a law professor. So let me just shut up and let you respond and ask questions. And please give me your frank feedback because I could use it, and tell me how I can be helpful.
So we usually do questions in the chat, but we have so few people.
Yeah, I think we can just
freestyle it, I think. I did have one, or I have a couple questions, but so can you talk maybe a little bit about what the successful, you listed a bunch of campaigns there, could you talk any more about what these successful campaigns looked like? Like who were the people that were running them? What did the politics of the area look like? Where it was successful, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because I kind of skipped over it just to get to the end. I felt like I was going on and on. But let me see if I can share with you again. Yeah, I lost that. Some of the characteristics of the campaigns and the way that they worked. First of all, I guess the main thing to think about is some of the campaigns have been led by immigrants themselves and immigrant rights organizations, and have really built immigrant capacity and furthered immigrant interests. And they often occur like they did in Maryland and a number of other places where immigrants form organizations and they build coalitions and then they agitate and find champions and enact sanctuary policies, immigrant voting, legal services, and so forth. That's happened here in San Francisco. In other places, maybe a voting rights organization or a maybe even well-intentioned community group or elected official might sort of say, hey, this is a good idea, let's do this, but doesn't really have immigrants as involved in that process. And they're more symbolic and less empowering in ways that other examples have been. And I think it's really important, especially now, given the sort of severe enforcement mechanisms and, brutal conditions immigrants are living in, again, in the shadows, that they have to be at the table at every stage, deciding whether to do this or not, how that might look, the campaign, what should be in the legislation, and how it might be implemented. And I've worked with people at different stages of this, but so in some places, they have contemplated or only enacted voting rights for legal permanent residents, for folks that are lawfully present in the United States. In other places, like here in San Francisco or in Maryland, any resident can vote regardless of citizenship status, documented, undocumented, right? But that's something that folks have grappled with, and there's different examples in different places. Some measures have been enacted or waged via a ballot, like the voters in the municipality get to vote yes or no, do we want to enfranchise immigrants? In other places, it's enacted by legislators. So like in New York City, it would be something that would be enacted by the legislators rather than the voters, as it was done here in San Francisco. In Maryland, it's often been by the legislators. Well, I could ramble on, but I'm going to shut up so I can see if I'm really answering your question.
No, yeah. I mean, I'm particularly interested in what a political entrepreneur is.
Oh, well, that's a good question. They've come in different sizes. So let's see, here's an example. After September 11th, here's like how to not do immigrant voting. The mayor of Rockville, Maryland, I forget his name now, he just thought it was a great idea to do immigrant voting, and that like it would be a good way to say, the demonizing of immigrants is a bad thing, which is a good impulse and maybe something we might agree with, but he kind of did it on his own without consulting other stakeholders and immigrant groups, or didn't really lay the groundwork for it. And he got hammered by even other people in the city council and then the media, and it died a bad death and kind of never came back. There's a guy in Cambridge, Massachusetts that sort of took it up and similarly didn't really do the groundwork and kind of used it to sort of advance his own political standing among liberal voters in terms of his record on immigrant rights by saying, here, I champion immigrant voting, but didn't do it in a way that could actually win immigrant voting or advance immigrant community base building and power. And ultimately, it didn't pass. But he got what he wanted, right? So, and this counters, if you think, Cambridge is a great example because in an earlier period of time, in the 2000s, immigrant voting was inaugurated by mostly Haitians who were trying to struggle to keep rent control, because they realized when they went to go talk to their city council people to say, hey, rent control is important, we need to keep this, don't lose it. The city council people often said, well, are you registered to vote? And kind of implied, and they figured out, oh, geez, because we can't vote, they don't really have to pay attention to us. Dan's point again. And so they said, well, shit, we want to win this rent control, so we better figure out how to get them to pay attention to us. Hey, we heard about this immigrant voting. Let's do that. And they built coalitions with some of the actual Irish immigrants that were there or Irish ethnic residents who had ties to a city council person who has a lot of pride in her Irish heritage. And they said, hey, did you know that in Dublin, you can arrive in Dublin and 6 months later you can vote, not just in Dublin elections, but in national elections. That's how the Irish do it. And if the Irish can do it, if it's good enough for, the Dubliners, what do you say about us? And they got the city council member to say, you're right, I'm for it. And they won it. But, because the state blocked its implementation, it had to be redone. And this guy in the more recent period, sort of did it in less of a coalitional way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I mean, I have more questions, but I'll let somebody else ask.
So one question I've had is, in theory, I want all non-citizen residents to be able to vote, including undocumented immigrants. But I was reading about this was something that happened in Portland, Maine.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they had been trying to implement it for like a decade, and then 2018 came around, and they realized like, oh crap, Trump's in office, and ICE is on steroids, and letting them have the right to vote could make deporting them a lot easier. So how could something like that be addressed, or do you think that first we would have to go with legal permanent residence, and then build off of the advances from that?
Dan, you asked the most important question that everyone wants to know and grapple with, because that's the hard reality for a lot of folks. And let me give you sort of by way of trying to answer that. Here in San Francisco, in 2016, after two tries previously of winning immigrant voting, it passed in part as a sort of fuck you to Trump. Excuse my language. And yet, the folks who were advocating and won immigrant voting kind of were like, holy shit, what did we win? Here we are with, our names on a list, right? You register, you put your name on a list, and you're a target under Trump. So the implementation was really fraught, and it has been challenging, and the turnout has been kind of anemic. There's some really great resources that immigrant groups use to engage their members, parents in schools and immigrant organizations. And the city is pretty decent on, legal services and sanctuary policy and a whole host of things. And yet, immigrants are a little bit wary for all the right reasons. The same is true in Maryland, where, immigrants can vote. The turnout has declined since the election of Trump, but even before then, under Obama, who is known as the deporter in chief for reasons that unfortunately fit, and so this question of, so in New York City, this is one of those things that when I was there and recently, people have done a lot of hand wringing. Do we include everyone? We started off saying yes, it should be everyone. And when we went to the city council, they were like, well, you're not talking about the undocumented, right? Because that's a non-starter. That's not going to pass. So we're like, well, okay, how can we push this? So we said anyone that's lawfully residing. So that means anybody basically except for a tourist visa. So that's like anyone has a work permit, a student visa, all kinds of different visas. There's like 26 different visas. So it's not just people that are legal permanent residents already on the pathway to citizenship, just waiting for their, 5 years or whatever the process is to get access to citizenship and voting, but to be more inclusive, because, it's like 1 million people in New York City who would be eligible, and making it around lawfully present is more inclusive than just LPRs. But like the question of what's feasible. So in Portland, I had the pleasure to go up and talk to the folks in Portland and meet with a bunch of people and work with Anna, who was one of the main champions in other groups. It was a Green Party effort, actually, that initially did it. And they got real damn close. It's kind of interesting in 2010. And so they've been trying ever since. But this question of who do you include, who do you don't, this is where I really reinforce, you need to have, seems to me, the real stakeholders involved in deciding that. That's the immigrants themselves and the immigrant organizations. They have to be at the table. They have to be the ones that help decide that, because it's about them. Now, having said that, there's other stakeholders too. And the question is, how do you build those coalitions in ways that are really egalitarian and meaningful and effective? But that's the potential power too, right? Because you think about the power of building coalitions, that can really move a bunch of different agendas, not just winning immigrant voting, but some other things around Amazon or you name it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been, the positive examples, I think, are the ones where win or lose, you build capacities and you build coalition and you advance agendas. And then there's lots of examples of that, but it's always, a changing time.
All right.
Yeah.
Any other does anyone else have any questions? I know Dan had more. Does anyone else have questions?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I've been doing a lot of reading lately about the Reconstruction, and I'm reading about how, the entire question about who is allowed to vote didn't even come up until after slavery was abolished, right? And then it's all about, well, who do we not want voting? And so what's on my mind is all about how groups were left out intentionally and how it was crafted. And so I'm wondering, where is exactly the barrier here? Is it state level for all states?
Yeah, that's the short answer. It is state level that determines voting. My favorite example of how states still largely determine so much about voting. We have a presidential election is basically like 50 elections all on the same day, right? That's what the Electoral College does. But even the way that the election laws are written and who conducts the elections are state actors and state law, state entities. In many states, if you've been convicted of a felony, you lose your voting rights. If you're in some places, after you've even served your time, you still lose your voting rights for life. In some other places, your voting rights are restored. In Maine and a couple of other places, you can vote from jail, serving a felony, right? So states still, some places like California, you can vote by mail. Other places, it's like Louisville, Kentucky. There's one place to vote in Louisville, Kentucky. They went from 200 polling places to one. So like those state actors really shape participation. And that's partly why they do fight over the rules, because they can shape the outcomes, right? So the short answer is, and there's where we've been really successful at partnering with either law students or law professors that have worked in coalition with organizations that are trying to explore immigrant voting, right? So what would the legal changes be if it has to get done at the state level in Virginia versus, are there charter cities that have power that could be used as a strategy to work? And, is that going to be challenged in the courts? And is that worth that effort? There's lots of different questions, but there's tons of material I could send you that sort of does this way better than I'm explaining it, if that could be helpful. And there's lots of like arguments that immigrant voting rights advocates use to advance their case, and there's answers to the objections that people raise that also can be used as tools. There's a whole bunch of tools that people have developed over the years that I'd love to share, and they'd love to share because maybe it could do you some good and advance this stuff.
All right, well, I'll ask the next question. This kind of leads into what I think you just said is like, do you talk about, I mean, I know I'm never gonna convince my Trump-loving extended family that this is a good idea, but I feel like even trying to convince some of my more liberal friends, I think they're like, what are some of the arguments you've heard from that kind of crowd? And what are the, like, how do you combat that, I guess? Like, what are your, do you have some good counter arguments?
Good. I can relate. I have I have some family in just outside of Richmond, Virginia, and down in Virginia Beach that would similarly, well, they shudder at, you know, knowing me and what I have to say. But here are some like here are some of the debates, right? Like, okay, well, they say, look, immigrants, there's already a pathway for immigrants to get the vote. Like, they don't need to get the vote before they become citizens. Like, the real answer is people should become citizens. Like, that's the thing, right? That's the whole argument, or one of the main ones is, you know, citizenship first, voting rights second, and these immigrants should do what everyone else has done, become a citizen. And so that's one argument. I'll come back to how we can counter that. Another one is, you know, if you give immigrants the right to vote, it's going to devalue citizenship and naturalization and incentives to naturalize. We don't want to do that. And, you know, there's these divided loyalties, dual loyal, you know, there are going to be the allegiance to two sovereigns, you know, or that, you know, paternalistic argument. They need time to really understand the American system and to use the vote responsibly. And this is, you know, the fraud bugaboo that immigrant voting is going to create all kinds of havoc. This one's a real one that might foster tension between different minority groups, or put people at risk, as we were talking about. You know, you put people's name on a list, they could become targets. All right, so here's the immigrant voting responses to these. Well, you can do both, right? We could still argue for expanding opportunities to become citizens, and you can encourage people to be able to vote prior to citizenship. That's what we did historically. That was the whole point of, you know, people pledging, declaring their intent to become a citizen, 2 years of residency, or, you know, just declare their intent to become citizen, and then you get the right to vote, maybe in just local or state elections before national elections. That's, you know, there's lots of different options there. But even more to the point, it's like, well, okay, so you say, yeah, it's so simple, go become a citizen, right? It's actually not simple. The average time it takes is quite long, and as the Trump administration has done, is make it basically virtually impossible or really hard for people to become citizens these days, even if they're here lawfully. Or at least it's certainly not as easy as it was for maybe your relatives who, you know, if you were to say, well, what's your ethnic background, what's your heritage? You know, they became citizens and they got the vote, right? Well, actually, yeah, it was a lot faster, easier, and cheaper to become a citizen historically. You know, if you were a European immigrant, you basically got here, you're on the path to citizenship. There's virtually no illegal immigrant apparatus that comes into being in the 1920s. For the Chinese, for African Americans, for Native Americans, for Mexicans, no, there's a different system for them. And then, you know, even if you say, right, let people become citizens in order to get the vote, we're still leaving out a whole bunch of folks who are here legally, but are not eligible to become citizens, right? So one of the ways that people that are immigrant voting rights advocates, they use these arguments to say, wait a minute, it's not so simple just to become a citizen. And here's some reasons why maybe we want to acknowledge immigrants' contributions and acknowledge their stakeholder status and give them voice and a vote. Well, what about this argument around dual citizenship and reducing people's incentive to naturalize? One lawyer said that enumerated that there's like 10 rights and privileges you gain by becoming a citizen. Voting's one. And in most cases, people are talking about immigrant voting rights at the local level, even only a few at the state level. Hardly anyone's talking about the national level. So you would still create incentives for people to naturalize. And there's, so there's still sharp distinctions. Okay, so what else? Oh yeah, this one. This is like one of the reasons that they said women, young people, African Americans need to wait, before we give them the vote, right? They're not really capable of exercising this vote properly. So it's very pejorative. I moved from New York City to San Francisco, right? I could vote here after I got here in 25 days. Did I know anybody? Did I even know what what would they call this person? It was like an office I never heard of before I came here. But I could vote. So that logic is undermined by the fact that people can vote without such time to learn civics. And then the fraud stuff, there's totally ways to safeguard elections. The fraud stuff is a bugaboo. Maryland has been doing it for years without problems. It's not like immigrant voting increases fraud or creates administrative problems. It can create administrative problems for people who worry about their name being on a list and being subpoenaed by the federal government and used to target them. That's a different problem. This one, I think this is like something to talk more about at some point, because in a lot of places, or a number of places, African Americans sort of struggle to get access to representatives and have, just sort of as a time when they were gaining representation and some power, their districts have become more diverse. And if you create opportunities for immigrants to vote, they could vote them out of office and vote in, and that creates some tensions. And there's been some African Americans in New York City and other places that have balked a bit. They won't necessarily say this, but a couple people have told me, frankly, that's an issue. And so that's something to think through. But again, the good news is that people have been able to find common ground. And this is the whole point about the coalitions and the finding the common ground that can really be empowering and uniting, right? This whole notion of solidarity that might be, anyway, so there's some things that maybe help, I hope, I don't know. Did that answer anything?
Yeah, that was great.
I can share my PowerPoint with you and some other material if that would be useful.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I'd love that.
Yeah, would you? Huh?
No, I was just going to say that immigrant voting rights folks have created a bunch of materials that, if you wanted to sort of explore this with people and launch something, there's really a lot of good, useful materials that might be useful. Like here in different parts of California, there's campaigns that are happening in Pasadena and Berkeley and other Santa Clara, Santa Cruz, and they're collaborating on creating materials, and curious how San Francisco did it and what they are using, and so people are sharing stuff.
Oh, well, all right. If you could email me the presentation afterwards, or if
Sure.
that would be fantastic, and I pass it on to our members. All right. Does anyone have any other questions?
I do, but I don't want to dominate if someone else has another question. One last question. All right, so you saw, I think on your PowerPoint, you had DC was listed there. It looked like there was some unsuccessful efforts in DC, and I was hoping you could talk about that.
Sure. DC tried this in 2004. It came out of some conflicts. Well, I'm trying to remember the circumstances, but there were a bunch of mostly Salvadorian immigrants in Adams Morgan section of DC that were agitating around police violence against them and some other issues around housing and jobs. And an African-American representative of that district and a bunch of immigrant rights organizations and some other folks promoted immigrant voting as a mechanism to create greater accountability of the police and greater responsiveness of the city. And it gained support and it got some good media, and it was really something that we were hopeful about, but it got thwarted. It didn't have enough support in the city council, and the time passed for the bill to be still valid, and it died. And then it didn't get picked up again until 2010 or 2015. Maybe it was 2015 again. That was David Grasso, who was the main sponsor, and I think he's still there in the city council there in DC. David Grasso didn't do as much of the base building as had done previously, is the way I understand it, but there's other people who you may know who may have a better sense of that. But he actually had, I think, the sympathy of the mayor, but not enough of the city council, or was it the other way around? But it just fell shy of winning support to pass it, and it died. But there's a new day there in DC, and I think a lot of people are kind of tiptoeing around this a bit. I mean, there's Burlington, there's places in Vermont that have toyed with it again recently. Hyattsville and Mountain Rainier in Maryland passed it just a couple of years ago. Portland has been thinking about it. New York's been thinking about it. But I think people are kind of like, okay, look, if Trump gets defeated and if Biden's in, then it'll be easier to do this next year, right? Both politically, but also like immigrants won't be so afraid to register to vote, and it might be more meaningful. So that's something that I think is happening in different places. I'm not sure that really answers your question.
No, yeah, no, that's great.
I had a comment, Dan.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Ron, I think it's an important point that localities can try it first, because you mentioned Maine, and as people may know, Maine is going to have statewide ranked choice voting, and they tried that in localities in Maine. So like, Montgomery County or Hyattsville or certain localities can try it first. But then later on, if it's successful, then it can catch on and move to statewide.
Yes, absolutely. That's something that happened in New York. It bubbled up to a statewide piece of legislation, and a campaign. It didn't go very far, but I think this next year it might actually get elevated to the state level and the city level in a bigger way. But you're absolutely right that the so-called laboratories of democracy in the United States, this sort of decentralized political structure, allows for these experiments, good and bad. But to the extent that the localities can enact things and show that they work, right, that gives them traction to not only spread to other localities, but to be elevated to the state level if there is that political will or a campaign that can help win it. Absolutely.
All right. Any other questions, comments for Ron?
So what do you think you might do? I'm curious. Can I ask a couple of questions? What do you think you might do around all this?
I am not sure yet because it's again, it's tricky because, you know, like I mentioned briefly, we are a state where we can't where the we are a state where localities can't, you know, pass their own laws regarding things like this. They have to, there has to be a state approval, and our county board has a very long history of saying, oh, we can't do anything because of the Dillon rule for basically anything and everything. If I recall correctly, and Jill, who is now gone, but she's she's in the leadership of the Arlington Democratic Party. If I recall correctly, when we were on the phone, you mentioned something about this starting off in internal elections and local political parties. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's an organization let me see if I can look it up for you. In Arlington that tried to sort of do immigrant voting, but they started within their own organization and they used themselves as a model. Let me see if I can pull it up for you. Yeah, there's been examples in North Carolina, Madison, Wisconsin. Okay, yeah, in 1994, Arlingtonians for a Better County, ABC was the name of the organization. Local nonpartisan political organization allowed non-citizens to vote in its internal elections to recommend members to the local school board. It also advocated for allowing non-citizens to vote in school board elections, and immigrant voter rights advocates and some other locales in Virginia explored this, but it didn't go anywhere. That's the sort of.
What was the name again?
They were called Arlingtonians for a Better County, or ABC. Arlingtonians for a Better County. 1994 is when they did this. There was some news about it. That's how I learned about it. It was like reported. Wow. I can send you the chapter where I have this cited, or send you the citation, but yeah, so there is that history, and that's certainly something that people are doing in other places, is allowing people that are not citizens to be appointed to commissions and boards, or to do participatory budgeting, where you don't have to be a citizen, you can even be under 18 to vote. But this question about, like, is it guaranteed that you can't do it in Arlington and the state? I wonder if you could, like, if you talked about.
It's not guaranteed. It's something where they consult with their county attorney in Arlington, who tells them they can't do it. If they do it, they could go ahead and do it, but they could get struck down in court, and that's happened in the past for Arlington, where they tried to do things and they were struck down, but they're definitely not forbidden from doing things. They just believe they are.
Right. Well, that's why I was encouraging to think about trying to connect to some of the law professors or law students that might be able to do some of this research for you, because as I mentioned, there's some places where, like here in California, it looks like the election law and the Constitution doesn't allow it. And here we are in San Francisco, people are voting in school board elections that are not citizens, because these savvy attorneys made compelling legal arguments and convinced people who were willing to politically make the fight, right? There's sort of the legal arguments, but then there's the political fight. And yeah, maybe it might end up in the courts, and that'll be the way it gets settled. But if they have some good legal arguments, like they did in New York and in California, that's the basis for a campaign that can win other things. Even if you don't win immigrant voting, you can still win other things in the campaign. right? You can elevate immigrant voices, you can elevate the demands, and not just for the vote, but like some of the issues that might be tethered to that. But maybe you'll be able to win the vote too. I have no idea. I just wouldn't encourage you to think about consulting with some other attorneys other than their attorneys.
And yeah, and I also think that trying to push for local political parties and civic associations to adopt these would to adopt non-citizen voting would be a really good start, because then that would also get people thinking about it more, and the more and more people are thinking about it, the more it becomes a major political issue, and then that can build the momentum to sort of push this at higher and higher levels of government.
I mean, Arlington has like a huge proportion of foreign-born people, right?
I know it's I don't know the numbers either, but it is significant. Arlington.
I just wanted to share quickly, I Googled Arlingtonians for a Better County, not expecting to find anything, but I did, and it is on the Arlington Democrats website on their history page. And it sounds like basically, I'll read from it briefly. The 1950s saw, this is their history, 1950s saw the emergence of organizations like Arlingtonians for a Better County, designed to give political voice to liberal-leaning citizens put off by the conservative nature of the Byrd Democratic Party. So I guess they were like the less racist Democrats.
Yeah.
Was the origin. And then it says in the 60s and 70s, many activists who came through Arlington's for a Better County would ultimately wrest control of the Arlington Democratic Committee from the Byrd organization.
Mm.
So I guess they hung around until the 90s?
Yeah. It was 1994 when they enacted their internal voting mechanism.
So Ron, was that your book that you were referencing, Democracy for All?
It is.
All right, cool, thanks.
Yeah, I'm happy to send you most of the PDF that I have of it, but it's not the whole thing. But sure, you can have it, use it. Sure, go buy it if you want, but I can send it to you.
All right. Anyone else? Anything else?
If I could be helpful to you going forward, don't be bashful. Let me know. If you have
fantastic. Okay, good. All right, good to know.
I'm one of these junkies. I love this stuff, and I think that you are of my ilk. Being in our revolution, and so
Awesome.
I mean,
Yeah. All right. So yeah, no, thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. I hope it was helpful, and you're not alone. There's other people out there in lots of states that are thinking and doing what you're contemplating. So hopefully next year will be a better year politically, and things like this could be more feasible and doable and worthwhile. But I really encourage you to, connect to immigrant organizations to think this through.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's that was Ron. Ron, you're welcome to stick around if you'd like, but now we're going to be moving on to other parts of the meeting. We didn't have an agenda set up. Dan, I believe there was something you wanted to discuss, wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I just had one quick thing. There's a couple folks approached us about a new kind of campaign that they're kicking off. Or I guess, it's not, I don't know how new it is, but I guess it's a new group about no racist tech in Arlington. So this is basically about the Ring cameras. I talked to them on the phone the other day. One of them is part of La Colectiva. Basically, it's a Arlingtonians and tech industry people, and both, of which I am both actually, basically trying to end any existing or possible future partnerships between Arlington County Police and Amazon Ring. So Amazon Ring, if you're not unfamiliar, is a little like doorbell camera thing. Basically, Amazon creates a deal with the police department where the police department can access people's Ring cameras very easily. And Amazon does things like coaches them on how to get people to give them access to those cameras and avoid having to get permission from a judge and things like that. And just in general, not even just with Ring, but facial recognition in general as a technology has been very problematic and I would say racist. You know, being someone who programs computers for a living, those, you know, they call it artificial intelligence. And I think people think of like, oh, this is like, you know, a robot from Star Wars or something where it can think. It's like, no, this is a program someone wrote. And whoever wrote it has any prejudices or biases that that person had. And they've done, you know, I did a little reading about this, and they've done, you know, a bunch of studies showing that these facial recognition technologies are significantly worse at identifying Black people. So what happens is you get like false positives. So, you know, imagine someone walking by somebody's house and they've got facial recognition on their camera and it says, oh, this person doesn't live in this neighborhood. And then they call the police, or the police maybe get automatically notified or something like that. And it turns out, well, this wasn't actually that person. It was somebody else who was misidentified. And that happens at that misidentification happens much more frequently with Black people than with white people. You know, and it just basically compounds every existing issue with the criminal justice system and policing, because it just makes it so much easier to, you know, it makes it so much easier for people to say, hey, why is this person in my neighborhood? You know, it kind of just amps up the tension. The other thing is that these algorithms are trained on databases and when it tries to match a face, it matches it against like basically mugshot databases. And of course we know these mugshot databases are built by the same police departments that we know are, you know, have racist policies and are much over, the people in the mugshot database will be, you know, Black and other minorities will be very vastly overrepresented. So basically this just kind of compounds, gives the police more power, it compounds things. You know, that's there's many reasons that this is a bad idea. There's some places that have already banned facial recognition completely. And of course, you know, Amazon doesn't need more power over our lives in the public sphere. So all those things together, I'll paste, I told them I would bring it up and I'll paste a link to their petition. The one guy that I talked to, I'm like, oh, so where do you work in tech? And he's like, well, I work for this coworker.org website, which is actually the website where this petition is hosted. It's actually a very nice website, so that's cool. I'm like a website critic because it's what I do for a living. So I was impressed by the website. Let's see, what else? Yeah, I mean, I guess that's it for now. I think they're kind of still gearing up, and I know this is something that like La Colectiva has done things with. And just as kind of an aside, given that we're all remote, it is much easier to show up to meetings now. I know we're all in a lot of meetings, but like if you want to speak before the county board, you don't have to get up early and like drive to courthouse. You just need to like log on. So, and they do listen to people. I think there's I mean, they don't do what they say, obviously, but it does move them, I think. And we heard I think there's a lot of things happening that wouldn't have happened had the pressure not been there. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm encouraging people to take time to, you know, send emails, but especially show up in these meetings and tell them what they need to hear and get that on the public record, because I think it does change what happens. I mean, obviously we're not going to get our way on everything we want, but if we can move the needle a little bit, I think that's worth it. That's all I had to discuss. So we usually do like a little open forum. I don't think we have any other things, Dan. For
Yeah, no, we don't. This was a surprisingly bare bones meeting. I'm glad we were, which kind of worked out because it meant Ron got lots of time to talk, lots and lots, got to go way more in depth than normally we
He was
normally do.
awesome. I would love. Yeah, that guy. That was very, very helpful.
Yeah.
He was a very, very well informed guy on that.
Mm-hmm.
I had one thing to bring up since Dan mentioned to tag onto the county board meeting, which is that, as everybody probably knows, the eviction ban is ending, and Arlington County has committed only $500,000 to the rent relief program, and there aren't any details that on. I know that a particular person sent a letter to Matt DiFerranti, but there's not a response that they have committed to doing any more than that at this point. So I don't know what their plan is, but obviously disappointing that the governor did not, by governor's order, extend the eviction ban, but there's nothing we can do about that. And most judges are probably going to restart evictions shortly. So Arlington County probably should be doing more than what it's committed to doing right now.
Kira, do you know how exactly that rent? Just so I would know what I'm talking about if I bring this up with people. How does the rent relief fund work in Arlington?
So it's through DHS, the Department of Human Services. You have to call them, and I guess they have to qualify you that, and there's a process where people have to wait. There are people that have gotten it, but I see on Facebook groups that there's other people that haven't heard anything back. Since there's 50% of Arlington is renters, and statistics say 5,000 of them didn't pay their rent during the COVID. I don't know what. It's hard to say exactly how many people are in danger of eviction, but it was likely to be a significant number. So Arlington got money through the CARES Act from the federal government, but it's decided it gets to decide how to allocate that money. That's one thing. I'll forward the letter that was sent to Matt to the group if I can.
Who sent the letter? The Green Party or?
Yeah, I think it was John Reeder actually.
I can let people know what's happening with the teachers union right now. So, maybe you already know, I'll be super brief, but APS is offering to students that they can either come back in person 2 days a week and the rest of the days would be virtual, or you can do virtual full-time. And teachers are being sent a survey asking them to choose if their preference is to teach virtually or in person. People like teachers' assistants and people like that, I believe, are being given the preference survey, but it seems that they won't really have a preference because if any kindergartner opts into school, they have to be there. So the union has, it has not been stated.
Sorry, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
I thought there were no teachers unions in Virginia.
Yeah, so it's like the not union, okay? So the sorry, where was I?
you mentioning that if one kindergartner wants to come in, then like basically the support staff have to come in.
Okay. So they have not stated what will happen if 80% of teachers say that they prefer virtual teaching and 80% of families opt for the in-person teaching. They have not explicitly said that you will be fired for not reporting, but you know, that seems to be the implication. I mean, they're telling people you can take family medical leave, but that has a lot of limits. So just keep an eye on the news. The union sent a message today to both the superintendent as well as press about the extreme health concerns of bringing hundreds of children before a small group of adults. And I am hearing that in other nearby jurisdictions, there's a lot of talk about striking. So just keep your ear to the news.
Very interesting. If I was a teacher, there's no way in hell I would be going back in, but man.
I know, right? But it's
Tough position to be in.
it's isn't it something though that if you opt out, then you lose your health care? Right?
Yeah, that's the great part about America.
Yeah.
It's that you have to die in the street if you don't have a job.
Yep.
What was I gonna ask? Oh, I mean, this it sounds like the survey that they're sending to teachers, like what your preference is, it is not binding. It's not like this means you will get to teach remotely. It's like,
Right.
if you say that you would rather come in, you will definitely be coming in. If you say you would rather teach remotely, maybe you'll get to teach remotely.
Yes.
Is there any thermometer like read on how many, like what parents are picking?
Yeah, so I'm going to estimate that a month ago, a survey was sent to both parents and staff, just saying, you know, we're looking for a read on the community. It was at least a month ago, if not more than a month ago, and it was asking people to rank how concerned they are about returning in person in the fall. And my numbers might be slightly off, but not greatly off. And that was that around 40% of parents said that they want kids in school only, and that around 40% of staff said that they were extremely concerned about returning to buildings in the fall. So.
Okay.
So it looks like like right now, the last read that we got was, you know, parents they don't have to respond until the 20th of this month, but it's looking like of the respondents, about 80% are opting for the in-person school.
I mean, it kind of, who knows, it might be moot because we could just be in lockdown again by then.
There's a lot of chatter that suggests that this might all just be almost a charade, and then the third day of school, when somebody gets it, then they're going to close down and say, well, we tried.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what are you going to do if the kid gets it? Like, well, you'd be like, okay, well, everyone that was around this kid is now, I mean, I don't know, it seems nuts to me, but.
Yep. So did I say this part already, that the union said that they are imploring the decision to be made for it to be virtual only? Did I say that already?
I think so.
Okay, sorry.
That's very interesting. Didn't Virginia pass a law that allowed some unionization of like public sector employees?
Yeah, so that would go into effect this year.
It didn't just go into effect?
I mean, I am unclear about the dates of it all, but like when we were interviewing the candidates for endorsements, what was on everybody's was we are about to, you know, unionize essentially. So I don't really know the dates but it is coming.
Okay. Anybody else? All right,
Looks like we can end early today then.
we're wrapping up.
All righty. We will see you all next month.
All right. Thanks,
Thanks
guys.
for coming, everybody. Bye, Susan.
Thanks for coming. Bye.